Okay, a common question that comes up about this time of year, not surprisingly, is how should I be studying for the BIS 2B exam? So I'm just doing a short YouTube that I'll post a link to on the website, and if you're listening to that, of course, you know that because you're there, and email everybody about this information. So there's a lot of material and little time, so everyone needs to be efficient and think critically about the exam. And I suggest that to be try placing yourself in my shoes. What would how would you write the exam? You got 45 minutes. Then that we have. It's a big class and we have limited grading capacity, so we don't want to have all scantrons, but about 75% of the points will be on scantrons and about 25 through basic fill-in questions, either problems or matching true false, short answer, those kinds of things. By the way, you don't need to bring a Scantron form, and history suggests that about 25 Scantron questions and 5 fill-in questions occupies that whole 45-minute question period, and so that's the length of the exam. No calculators, just bring your ID and a pen, and you'll be set to go. So, taking the exam, don't run out of time before you get to all the fill-in questions. This happens to people, and it's very, very, very painful. So it's just a guaranteed loss of points by not getting started on something where you have to write out an answer. So we post the time as the period proceeds, and you can look up at the chalkboard every once in a while and see how much time is left. And I recommend starting with the fill-in questions at the beginning, or else making sure that you move to them with at least 25 minutes to go, so you have plenty of time to give this your full attention and give it the work that it deserves. I mean, because even if you do really well on all the Scantron and then below the fill-in examples, that's 75% on the exam. That's a really bad score, so you don't want to do that. But if you're stuck on a Scantron question that might be eating up all the time, try noting it on your exam. You can write on those exams, note which possible answers you might use. That way, if you get onto the fill-in and then you run out of time, you can at least come back and guess on those Scantron things. And if you've made notes that you think it's either B or D or A and C or something like that, you can come back and just take a guess. So, and again, I'd look at the board and reserve those final 5 minutes or so to that Scantron exam to make sure that you've bubbled in everything, that you've sort of bubbled it in 1 through 25 as opposed to 2 through 26 or something, and that you've only got one answer per each question, and that this is a good time to use those notes on your exam to make an educated guess about questions that are stumping you. So, lecture notes versus book. Everyone asks about allocating time to study. So let me tell you a bit about how I make the exam. I use the book as a guide to frame the lectures and frame the topics, and that they are designed in the order they are, more or less, that all the BIS2s do it this way, in this order, more or less, because it works with the lab sections that are fixed across quarters and across sections. So I'm going to use examples from the book and beyond. The book has we chose this book because it has some really great illustrations of how and explains things well. But when sitting down to write the questions, I focus on the learning objectives for each lecture and try and write to those objectives. So I try and write about 3 questions for each lecture, and that hit each of the primary learning objectives. Now there may be 3 to 6 big learning objectives in each, and so I would go through your lecture notes and try and identify what those are. What are the big topics? So for example, I'm recording this on Wednesday, and we talked about trade-offs in life history attributes today, and endothermy and ectothermy, and as a means of reducing stress for temperature. And some of those things are some adaptations are some attributes that reduce stress are adaptations, and some are acclimations. So you can behaviorally change your exposure to stress. And so I think about what are some examples that illustrate these big that we use in class that illustrate these big issues. I try very hard not to write trick questions, and in going through some of these examples as example questions in class, I tell you that they're often harder than I would want them to be, because I'm actually alluding to something that we haven't covered yet. So there is a lot of information. So some students don't agree with my assessment that I try not to write trick questions, but because I also try not to write many drop-dead obvious questions that just regurgitate definitions. So example would be true or false. Ectotherms use metabolic pathways to regulate their body temperatures above ambient temperature levels. Well, that's the definition of an endotherm, not an ectotherm, and so that's an obvious false, but it's just simply the definition. So we're trying to get questions that are a little bit more nuanced than that. So what I recommend people do is outline the 3 to 6 major points on each lecture, focus the understanding on these major concepts, and then bear in mind some critical examples used in class. Now, just a final thing I'm going to cover here is that I structure the things the way I do in this class for a specific reason. First off, you'll note that the learning objectives aren't written on the slides. And I do that because I want you to think through the information and extract those learning objectives yourself. They're not subtle. And that I think you should be able to try and figure out what are the big points. And I think by working on that, it helps solidify the knowledge of those things for you. I have interesting sidebars scattered throughout the lecture. Try and recognize what is an interesting sidebar scattered through the lecture that then becomes something that you probably don't have to spend a tremendous amount of time focusing on in terms of the exam. Nonetheless, I think that my job in Biz 2B is in part to portray the richness and the exciting nature of biology across all different fields of biology, and so, or different areas of biology, and get you enthusiastic about the natural world and the diversity of the world that we live in. I certainly find it to be an interesting place. So I do a fair bit of that, but I'm going to, in the exam, stick to the major points. Videos are up for a week. Podcasts remain all quarter. As I mentioned today in class about posting the practice questions, I'm really trying to encourage you to use your better natures. And so the experience on this campus and others in video lectures is that people unfortunately put things off and end up binge watching these videos before the exam. And it's not an effective way to learn the material. It's not an effective way to do well in the test. It's not an effective way to retain this information that you might need in future classes. So we want to do everything we can to discourage you from doing that. And so we don't leave the videos up all the way to the end. Now, so they're up for a week, so you have to take a timely approach to looking at them. But the podcasts do remain there all quarter, and you can go back and revisit issues as you see fit with the podcasts. They're there for your use. It's a little harder to go through those because, as I said before, I don't beep when I change slides, and so it requires listening to the podcast, flipping through the PDF from the lecture and trying to stay on it. It takes a little more concentration. I think it might be a little bit more intellectually engaging way than watching the videos in some senses. I post the practice questions 1 week prior to the exam because I'd like you to be studying and reviewing material generally rather than specifically to the exam. The questions that I pose are both in the style and on topics that I think are important, so they are a hint to what I think are the major learning objectives to things. I'm not going to pose practice questions that are off topic. But I don't post the answers to those questions until just a few days before the exam, and that's because I'd like you to go through those questions and then think critically about them. We learn a lot better when we are forced to engage our brains and think critically about things. And so lecture notes prior to practice questions prior to answers, I think is a good way to do that. And so that's the way I encourage you to study for this class. So with that, that's a little under 10 minutes. I hope that's helpful, and good luck.